It began as the more disagreeable affairs so often do, with a perfectly civil invitation and a breakfast egg insufficiently boiled. Lord Peter Wimsey, whose tolerance for murder was considerably greater than his tolerance for culinary inaccuracy, looked down at the offending object with an expression of mild theological distress. "My dear Bunter," he said, tapping the shell delicately with his spoon, "there are crimes which cry to heaven, and there are eggs which merely whimper. This one, I think, has lost its nerve." "Very sorry, my lord," said Bunter, in the tone of a man who accepted responsibility for the fall of empires if it occurred before luncheon. "The second post has arrived." "Ah," said Wimsey, "letters, the last refuge of the tactless." Bunter placed the silver salver at his elbow. Among the usual invitations begging letters and printed appeals for causes too respectable to be interesting lay a single envelope of thick gray paper. It bore no crest, no sender's address, and only Wimsey's name, written in a hand so rigidly controlled that it suggested either a schoolmistress or a murderer. Wimsey lifted it between two fingers. "Not from a lady," he observed. "No, my lord. A lady would have made the hand look less like a confession. Besides, the paper is expensive without being tasteful. That is almost always masculine." He slit the envelope. The note inside contained only 5 lines. "Lord Peter, I am instructed to beg you to come at once to Blackthorn Vicarage, near Ely. A death has occurred under circumstances which the police are unwilling to discuss, and Scotland Yard has declined to pursue. I cannot put more in writing. The matter concerns not merely murder, but reputation, inheritance, and a danger to others still living. Yours faithfully, Arthur Bellamy." Solicitor Wimsey read it twice. At the second reading, his long, rather foolish face lost its breakfast expression and became merely attentive. "Bunter," he said, "what does one wear when Scotland Yard declines to pursue?" "Grey, my lord. Admirable. Nothing too hopeful." By 11 o'clock he was in a motor car moving through the flat fen country, where the land lay stretched beneath the sky like something drowned and not yet buried. The road ran between black ditches and winter fields. Willows leaned together in consultation. Here and there a church tower rose with gaunt confidence from a cluster of roofs, as though asserting the existence of God in a district where the evidence was not otherwise strong. Blackthorn proved to be less a village than an arrangement of damp brick, pale smoke, and old grievance. At its center stood the vicarage, a square Georgian house with blinded windows, a rookery behind it, and a yew hedge clipped into the solemn ugliness favored by people who confuse severity with virtue. The front door was opened by a butler of such extraordinary pallor that Wimsey, for one indecorous instant, wondered whether the corpse had mistaken its appointment. "Lord Peter Wimsey," said the butler. "So far," said Wimsey, "though after a journey through your fens, one begins to feel provisional." The butler blinked. Humor, plainly, was not encouraged at Blackthorn Vicarage. "This way, my lord." He was conducted to a drawing-room in which everything was correct, expensive, and faintly hostile. Heavy curtains shut out the gray afternoon. A coal fire burned without warmth. On the mantel stood a row of little clocks, none agreeing with any other, and above them hung a portrait of a sharp-nosed clergyman whose painted eyes seemed to disapprove of the dust. There were 3 people in the room. The first was Arthur Bellamy, the solicitor, a neat, dry man with parchment skin and spectacles that flashed whenever he moved his head. The second was Inspector Mordaunt of the county police, large, red-faced, and unhappy in the presence of aristocracy. The third was a woman in black, seated very upright near the fire, with hands folded in her lap as though she had put them there to prevent them betraying her. Bellamy came forward. "Lord Peter, I am deeply obliged." "So I gathered. When a solicitor writes danger to others still living, he either means business or has been reading too much sensation fiction." Inspector Mordaunt coughed. "This is Mrs. Vale," said Bellamy, "widow of the deceased." Wimsey bowed. Mrs. Vale inclined her head. She was perhaps 35, perhaps 45. Grief had not aged her so much as varnished her. Her face was handsome in a colorless way, the sort of face that might have been admired in candlelight and distrusted at breakfast. "My husband was the Reverend Septimus Vale," she said. Her voice was low and almost without accent. "He was found dead yesterday morning in the locked vestry." "Locked," repeated Whimsy gently. "An ambitious word." "It was locked from the inside," said Mordaunt with professional resentment. "Key under his hand, window bolted, no other entrance. Doctor says heart failure brought on by shock. There's no case." "And yet," said Whimsy, "you are here." The inspector flushed. "There are circumstances. Circumstances are the natural enemies of official peace." Bellamy took a paper from his pocket. The Reverend Vale had received threats, anonymous threats, 3 letters in the past month. He dismissed them. "Clergymen are trained to forgive their enemies," said Whimsy. "It must be most inconvenient when the enemies object." Mrs. Vale's mouth tightened. "My husband had no enemies." "My dear madam," said Whimsy, "no man with a parish has no enemies. He has merely enemies who bring him soup." The inspector gave a reluctant snort and then looked ashamed of it. Bellamy continued. "The letters spoke of an old sin, a hidden name, and judgment to be delivered before Advent. Naturally, the local people have made something of it. Naturally. There is also," said Mordaunt, "the matter of the bell." Whimsy turned. "The bell?" "The vestry bell rang at 20 minutes past 11 on Tuesday night. Several people heard it. The vicarage maid, the sexton in his cottage, and Mrs. Vale herself. But the Reverend was not found until morning. By then he had been dead several hours. Did the bell commonly ring of its own accord? "No, my lord, a pity. It would simplify the matter enormously." Mordaunt scowled, uncertain whether he had been mocked. Whimsy walked to the mantelpiece. The clocks stared back at him with their separate opinions of time. One said 10 minutes to 4. Another insisted upon 2:30. A third had stopped altogether at 23 minutes past 11. He bent over it. "Charming little thing. French?" Mrs. Vale said. "My husband disliked it. It belonged to his first wife." "Ah," said Whimsy. The single syllable dropped very softly into the room. Bellamy looked at him sharply. "You see something?" "I see a clock," said Whimsy. "That is often dangerous enough." He turned away and allowed his eyes to drift over the room. The closed curtains, the polished floor, the chair placed too far from the hearth, the vase of dead chrysanthemums, the silver salver on side table, and near the door, a faint crescent of black mud pressed into the carpet. It was almost invisible, but not quite. "Has anyone come in from the garden?" he asked. "No one," said Mrs. Vale at once. "Not since yesterday morning," said the butler from the doorway. Whimsy glanced round. "You have an admirable habit of appearing when useful." The butler lowered his eyes. "I beg your pardon, my lord. Don't. It disturbs the rhythm. Your name?" "Grimshaw, my lord." "Of course it is." Mordaunt cleared his throat again. "We thought, Lord Peter, that you might advise whether there is any reason to involve London. But as I say, the Yard won't come. Superintendent says there's no murder unless we can show a murderer, and no murderer unless we can show how he got in." "A beautiful example of administrative circularity," said Whimsy. "Almost classical. One is reminded of the serpent devouring its own memorandum." Mrs. Vale rose suddenly. "You must understand," she said, and for the first time there was heat in her voice. "My husband was not merely a clergyman. He was a good man, a stern man perhaps, and not loved by fools, but good. If this becomes gossip, if the papers speak of locked rooms and judgment and old sins, his name will be torn apart by people who never knew him." "Names," said Whimsy, "are fragile articles. They crack more easily when polished." She looked at him with dislike. "I asked Mr. Bellamy to send for you because I was told you are discreet. I am almost offensively discreet. But I am also curious, which is less useful in a drawing room." Bellamy intervened. "Will you examine the vestry?" "Presently. First, I should like to know why Scotland Yard refused." Mordaunt shifted his weight. They said it was a local death without evidence of violence. That is what they wrote. That is what they said. On the telephone, yes. To whom? To me. At what time? The inspector hesitated. Yesterday afternoon, about 5. About 5, murmured Whimsy, the hour at which official certainty begins to smell of tea. He picked up the stopped French clock and held it near his ear. No tick, said Mordaunt. It's broken. Yes, said Whimsy, but brokenness, like virtue, has varieties. He set it down again, not quite where it had been. Outside, a rook cried from the yew trees. The sound came thinly through the curtains, like laughter heard under water. Very well, said Whimsy. Let us go and look at your impossible room. I have always disliked impossible rooms. They encourage people to believe in impossibilities, when the truth is usually some shabby little possibility wearing evening dress. Mrs. Vale moved toward the door, but Whimsy raised a hand. One moment, they all stopped. He was looking not at her, nor at the inspector, nor at the solicitor, but at the salver on the side table. It was round, silver, recently polished, and empty. Was there a visiting card there? He asked. The butler's face did not change, but something behind it withdrew. No, my lord, how very decisive. There has been no card there. Since when? Grimshaw paused. Since yesterday, my lord. Ah, said Whimsy again. Mordaunt stared. What has a visiting card to do with it? At present, said Whimsy cheerfully, nothing whatever. That is why it interests me. And with that he followed them into the hall, leaving behind the stopped clock, the mud crescent, the empty salver, and Mrs. Vale's face, which in the firelight had ceased for one instant to look bereaved, and had looked instead afraid. The passage to the vestry led through a corridor, which seemed to have been designed by a man suspicious of comfort. Its walls were hung with engravings of bishops, all of whom looked as though they had died refusing a second helping. At the far end, a green baize door opened upon a short-covered way joining the vicarage to the church. Convenient, said Whimsy. One may pass from domestic irritation to ecclesiastical disappointment without meeting the weather. Inspector Mordaunt produced a key. The vestry door was locked when we found him. We had to force it. Yet you have a key, the spare, kept in the vicarage pantry. Accessible to whom? To the household. That is to say, to everybody except the Archbishop of Canterbury, and one hesitates to exclude him altogether. Mordaunt gave him a look, then opened the door. The vestry was a narrow stone chamber, cold as a forgotten promise. A table stood beneath the window. On it lay service books, a brass candlestick, a blotter, and an inkstand. Against one wall hung cassocks and a surplice, pallid shapes in the dimness. A small bell-pull dangled near the fireplace, its cord disappearing upward into the wall. Reverend Vale had been found in the chair by the table. The chair remained there, slightly askew. On the floor beside it was a dark stain where ink had spilled and dried into the flagstones like an old bruise. Whimsy did not go at once to the chair. Instead, he looked at the window. Bolted from within? Yes. Glass intact? Quite. Chimney. Too narrow. We checked. One is relieved. Clergymen descending chimneys after death introduce theological complications. He crossed to the table and examined the blotter without touching it. Was he writing? No letter was found. Was paper missing? Bellamy answered. There should have been parish stationery in the drawer. It was empty. Mrs. Vale, who had followed them in spite of protesting fatigue, said, My husband often used much paper. Sermons, parish accounts, letters to troublesome people. Troublesome people must be grateful for their industry. Her eyes flickered. He believed correction was kindness, an opinion chiefly held by those administering it. The inspector frowned at the bell-pull. The bell rings in the kitchen passage. Cook heard it at 11:20. She thought the Reverend wanted hot water, but Mrs. Vale said he had retired. Did she? Whimsy turned gently. You were awake then? I had a headache. I was in my room. Alone? Naturally. My dear lady, nature is a spacious term, she colored. Yes, alone. Whimsy stooped near the fireplace. On the stone hearth lay a little scatter of grey ash, though no fire had burned there recently. He picked up a fragment between finger and thumb. "Paper ash," he said. "Burned in haste, not coal, not wood." Mordaunt leaned forward. "Could be anything." Indeed, the world is full of anything. Detection consists chiefly in finding the particular anything that had no business being. There, from the corridor came a faint sound, a shuffle, then silence. "Who is outside?" Mordaunt barked. The door opened a crack and the pale butler appeared. "I beg pardon, sir. Miss Harcourt has come." Mrs. Vale stiffened. Bellamy removed his spectacles and polished them with unnecessary care. Whimsy smiled. "Miss Harcourt," he said. "Now why do I feel we have reached the interesting noun in the sentence?" "She was the Reverend's niece," said Bellamy. "Was?" "She has lived here for 6 months. There was some quarrel yesterday." Mrs. Vale spoke sharply. "There was no quarrel. Eleanor was hysterical, as usual." "Ah," said Whimsy. "How convenient for everyone when the young are hysterical and the dead are respectable." He walked once round the room, pausing by the chair. Upon the arm, almost lost in the dark grain, was a tiny crescent scratch, fresh and pale. "Inspector," he said, "when the body was found, where was his right hand?" "On the floor, near the key, and the left clenched on the chair arm." "Clenched tightly." Whimsy looked at the scratch again. "Very tightly, I think." Then, quite suddenly, he tugged the bell pull. Far away in the vicarage, a bell rang once, thin and abrupt. But beneath it, from somewhere in the wall, came a second sound, a small, delayed click. Nobody spoke. Whimsy released the cord. "Well," he said pleasantly, "that is not supernatural, but it is exceedingly rude." Miss Eleanor Harcourt was waiting in the hall with the air of a person who had been told all her life to compose herself, and had discovered, too late, that composition was not a natural gift. She was young, dark-haired, and thin in the expressive, inconvenient manner that makes elder relatives talk of nerves when they mean truth. Mrs. Vale looked at her as one looks at a crack in good porcelain. "Eleanor, this is most unsuitable." "So was Uncle Septimus," said the girl. Inspector Mordaunt made a protesting noise. Bellamy murmured her name. Whimsy, however, bowed with elaborate courtesy. "Miss Harcourt, unsuitable remarks are often the only suitable ones in a house of mourning." She stared at him, then gave a short laugh which was nearly a sob. "I suppose you are the clever gentleman. I have been called worse by better people. They won't tell you the truth. No one ever does. It saves me the trouble of believing them, Mrs." Vale stepped forward. "Eleanor was overwrought yesterday. She had asked my husband for money." "I asked him for my money," said Eleanor. "My mother's money. He had no right to keep it," Bellamy interposed dryly. "The late Reverend was trustee until Miss Harcourt's marriage or 25th birthday. And he meant to prevent both," she said. Whimsy's eyelids drooped. "Both?" The management of youth must have occupied him considerably. "There was someone I wished to marry." "A curate?" asked Whimsy. "A doctor, worse. Clergymen distrust doctors. They are rival tradesmen in mortality." For the first time, Eleanor smiled properly, but it vanished at once. "Uncle sent him away, told him things about my mother, things that were not true," Mrs. Vale said. "You do not know they were not true." The girl turned white. "I know what he was." "And what?" asked Whimsy softly. "Was he?" The hall seemed to grow colder. Even the butler, stationed near the dining-room door, became less like furniture. Eleanor lowered her voice. "He enjoyed fear, not anger, not obedience. Fear he would forgive you beautifully, and then keep the sin alive in a drawer, labeled and dated. He had letters, old photographs, secrets from half the parish. People came here smiling and left looking older." Mordaunt said, "That is a serious accusation." "It is not an accusation. It is the furniture of the house." Whimsy glanced toward the drawing room, including, perhaps, the clocks. Eleanor looked surprised. "The clocks? Never mind. Did you see your uncle on Tuesday evening?" "Yes, at 9. Where?" "In the study. He had sent for me." An agreeable phrase, "sent for." It places one so exactly between a servant and a prisoner. "He said, Doctor." Lanyon had written again. He said if I persisted in disgracing the family, he would show him certain papers. What papers? I don't know. He would not say. He held a sealed envelope in his hand. Mrs. Vale's face sharpened. You never mentioned an envelope. No, said Eleanor, because you were listening outside the door. The accusation struck cleanly. Mrs. Vale did not move, but color rose slowly beneath her mourning veil. That is false. Whimsy looked at her with mild interest. Falsehood, like influenza, is often diagnosed too early. Bellamy coughed. Miss Harcourt, what happened after this interview? I left him. I went to my room. At 11, I heard him cross the hall toward the church passage. Alone? I think so. You think? There was another step, softer. Perhaps behind him, perhaps only the echo. The floors here echo. Not. Whimsy brightened. Excellent. An unusual echo is practically a confession wearing felt slippers. Mordaunt muttered, We are getting nowhere. On the contrary, Inspector, we are getting to the corridor, which is often better. Whimsy turned suddenly to Grimshaw. You polished the silver yesterday? Yes, my lord, including the salver in the drawing-room. Yes, my lord, before or after the Reverend died? Grimshaw's pale face tightened. Before, my lord. In the afternoon. And there was a card upon it then? No, my lord, Whimsy sighed. My dear Grimshaw, your loyalty is touching, but overpolished. Someone placed a card there after you cleaned the salver, and someone removed it before I arrived. The dust border remains. A visiting card is a small thing, but absence, properly framed, can be as ostentatious as a corpse. Eleanor whispered, A card, Mrs. Vale said nothing. Whimsy looked from one face to another and became suddenly frivolous. I should like tea, he said. Strong tea. Murder is fatiguing when everyone is so determined to behave well. Tea was served in the drawing-room, with a solemnity usually reserved for state, funerals, and unsuccessful engagements. Cook had produced seed cake, thin bread and butter, and a pot of tea so black and censorious that Whimsy regarded it with respect. This, he said, has moral fiber. Nobody smiled except Eleanor, and even she seemed ashamed of the impulse. Inspector Mordaunt stood with his back to the fire, notebook in hand, looking increasingly like a man who had found himself trapped in a conversation conducted in a foreign language. Bellamy sat near the window, thin knees crossed, spectacles flashing. Mrs. Vale poured tea as though dispensing medicine to patients she privately considered incurable. Whimsy accepted his cup and looked at the maid who had brought it in. You are Mary, I think, the girl bobbed. Yes, my lord. And you heard the vestry bell on Tuesday night? Yes, my lord, plain as anything. At 11:20. That's what the kitchen clock said, my lord. Does the kitchen clock keep good time? Mary looked uncertainly toward Mrs. Vale. It is wound every Sunday, said Mrs. Vale. A touching ritual, but not an answer. Mary swallowed. It runs slow sometimes, my lord. Cook says it has rheumatics. An ailment common to old clocks and young institutions. How slow? 10 minutes, maybe, sometimes more. Mordaunt frowned at his notes. You told me 11:20. It was 20 past by the kitchen clock, sir. Whimsy sipped his tea. Thus the bell may have rung at 11:30 by an honest clock or at 1/4 by a dishonest one. Time, Inspector, is a witness of notoriously loose habits. Mrs. Vale set down the teapot. Surely this is immaterial. Whether the bell rang at 20 past or 1/2 my husband was already in the vestry. Was he? She looked at him. He went there at 11. So Miss Harcourt believes. So I know. Whimsy turned his pale gaze upon her. You saw him? I heard him. Through your headache? Her fingers closed round the handle of the pot. I heard his step, said Whimsy, an intimate form of evidence. Married persons recognize one another by footsteps, coughs, and the particular way in which the newspaper is folded. Did you hear the church passage door close? Yes, and no other. No, Eleanor said abruptly. I heard too. Mrs. Vale's eyes flashed. You imagined it. Did I imagine the raised voices at dinner too? A silence followed, dense and unpleasant. Whimsy put down his cup. Raised voices are like mushrooms. They flourish in the dark and make excellent poison. Who raised them? Nobody answered. At last, Bellamy said, "The Reverend Vale received a visitor before dinner." "Ah," we approached the vanishing card. "A Mr. Josiah Crewe," said Bellamy, "a farmer from the edge of the parish. There had been a dispute about land left to the church." Mordaunt seized on this with relief. "Crewe threatened him last week in the street. Said he'd see him in his grave." "How refreshing," said Whimsy. "A suspect who understands plain speaking." "He came at 6, Bellamy continued. "Left at past. Grimshaw showed him out." Whimsy looked at the butler, who stood beside the door as colorless as candle grease. "Did Mr. Crewe leave a card?" "No, my lord. He is not a gentleman who uses cards." "A charming distinction. Then the card belonged to another visitor." "There was no other visitor," said Mrs. Vale. Whimsy rose and strolled to the mantel. He took up the stopped French clock again. "You dislike this clock, Mrs. Vale?" "My husband disliked it." "Because it belonged to the first Mrs. Vale. She died before I came here. That does not prevent jealousy. The dead occupy such excellent positions." The widow's face hardened. "I was not jealous of a corpse, no. Corpses are often less troublesome than their survivors." He opened the little glass door of the clock and moved the minute hand delicately. It resisted, then slipped forward with a faint internal click. "There," he murmured, 23 minutes past 11, an emphatic hour. "Inspector, when you found the body, was this clock in the drawing room?" "Yes." "Who noticed it had stopped?" "I did," said Eleanor. "At breakfast. I said it was strange." "And what did Mrs. Vale say?" Eleanor hesitated. "She said it had stopped before." Mrs. Vale's voice was cold. "It often stopped." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "But never, I think, without being told to." He replaced the clock and turned brightly to Mary. "One more question, if your conscience can survive it. When the bell rang, did you go at once toward the passage?" "No, my lord." Mrs. Vale came down first. In her dressing gown, Mary glanced at the widow. "No, my lord, she was dressed." For the first time, Mrs. Vale spilled a little tea into the saucer. Whimsy did not appear to notice the spilled tea. That was one of his more irritating accomplishments. He could ignore a fact so thoroughly that everyone in the room became unable to think of anything else. "Dressed," he repeated, with the air of a man discussing weather in the Hebrides. "How practical! Headaches are so much easier to bear in proper shoes." Mrs. Vale put the cup down with care. "I had not gone to bed. Forgive me, I understood you were in your room." "I was in my room, fully dressed." "Yes, with shoes." She looked at him then, and her face, for all its discipline, held something dangerous. "You are impertinent, Lord Peter." "Professionally, madam. It is the only branch of impertinence which pays its expenses." Inspector Mordaunt shut his notebook. "Really, Lord Peter, unless this has some bearing." "Everything has bearing. That is what makes life so untidy." Whimsy turned to Mary. "When Mrs. Vale came downstairs, did she seem surprised by the bell?" Mary's mouth opened and shut. "Answer," said Mordaunt. "She looked frightened, sir." "Naturally," said Mrs. Vale sharply. "A bell ringing at such an hour. Did she ask who had rung it?" Whimsy said. "No, my lord." The answer fell with small, dreadful neatness. Whimsy nodded. "Thank you. You may return to the kitchen and comfort cook's rheumatic clock." Mary fled. Bellamy leaned forward. "You imply Mrs. Vale knew who was in the vestry." "I imply nothing. Implication is the lazy man's deduction." Whimsy picked up a piece of seed cake and regarded it without affection. "I merely collect small domestic misbehaviors. One never knows when they may form a congregation." Eleanor, sitting very still beside the window, said, "There was another thing." Mrs. Vale turned. "Eleanor." "No, I have been silent long enough." The girl looked at Whimsy. "Yesterday morning, before they broke open the vestry, Grimshaw was in the passage. He had something in his hand." The butler's pale eyelids flickered. "What kind of something?" asked Whimsy. "A cloth, I thought, or a handkerchief." Grimshaw bowed his head. "I had been dusting, miss." "In the church passage," said Whimsy. "A noble but eccentric devotion to cleanliness." "It was muddy, my lord." Muddy, how fortunate you mention it. He crossed suddenly to the door and opened it. The hall beyond lay dim beneath the staircase, its polished boards reflecting the pale afternoon. At the edge of the drugget runner, near the passage leading to the church, was a faint smear almost erased. Whimsy went down on one knee. "Inspector, would you describe this as mud?" Mordaunt approached unwillingly. "Could be. Fen mud. I dare say. Do not dare say, Inspector. It is hard on the mud." He touched the mark with the corner of his handkerchief. It came away dark with a greenish tinge. "Not garden soil," he said. "Churchyard clay. Damp, alkaline, and unpleasantly affectionate." Bellamy frowned. "A person came through the churchyard, or went out by it. But the vestry was locked from within. So we are informed. The world is full of locked doors, most of them locked by people who wish us to admire the difficulty rather than test the lock." Mordaunt said heavily, "We tested it. Did you test the key?" "It was under the dead man's hand, an admirable hiding place. The dead are rarely accused of untidiness." Whimsy asked to see it. Mordaunt produced a small iron key from an envelope. Whimsy held it to the light. "Used often?" "Yes, it is the vestry key." "Then why is there candle wax in the barrel?" The inspector stared. Whimsy inserted a pin from his tie and dislodged a tiny flake of white wax. "Someone took an impression," he said. "Recently, very recently. One does not make wax impressions of keys for spiritual refreshment." Bella's face grew pinched. "Then there was a duplicate key, perhaps, or the intention of one. Tell me, Mr. Bellamy, who knew the Reverend kept important papers in the vestry?" The solicitor removed his spectacles again. "Many might suppose it. I did not ask who might suppose. Supposition is the legal profession's poor relation." Bellamy's voice dried further. "I knew Mrs. Vale knew. Grimshaw, perhaps. Miss Harcourt may have known. The Reverend was secretive, but not always silent. And Josiah Crewe, possibly." At that moment a harsh voice came from the open front doorway. "If you're asking after Josiah Crewe," it said, "you may ask him to his face." A broad, muddy man stood on the threshold, cap in hand, rain on his shoulders and rage in his eyes. "I hear Parsons dead," he said, "and I hear you're laying it at my door." Whimsy rose lightly. "My dear Mr. Crewe," he said, "doors are precisely what we are having trouble with." Josiah Crewe entered the hall as though entering a court already rigged against him. He was a thick-set man of 50, with a square beard, cracked hands, and boots that left honest black crescents on the polished floor. Grimshaw looked at the marks with a householder's horror and a guilty man's attention. Mrs. Vale rose. "Mr. Crewe, this is not the time." "It's never the time when gentry have done talking and farmers must answer," said Crewe. "But I'll not have them saying I crept about at night murdering Parsons." "Did you?" asked Whimsy pleasantly. Crewe swung round. "What?" "It saves so much paper to begin at the middle." "I did not." "Excellent. We advance. Did you threaten the Reverend Vale?" Crewe's jaw worked. "Aye, in the street with half the village listening. If I'd meant to kill him, I'd hardly have advertised it like a traveling circus." A sound objection, though criminals are often ruined by their own sense of drama. "You visited him Tuesday evening?" "I did. He sent for me." Bellamy looked up sharply. "He sent for you?" Crewe gave a hard laugh. "You thought I came begging? No. He had a letter. Said he'd found proof my father never had right to the South Meadow. Said church land was church land, and theft did not sweeten by passing through 2 generations. Was it true? My father paid for that land. Could you prove it?" Crewe's face darkened. "The paper's gone. Papers have a melancholy habit of vanishing in this house." Mrs. Vale said, "My husband acted according to conscience." Crewe looked at her. "Your husband used conscience like a whip." Eleanor lowered her head. The phrase had struck some private chord. Whimsy watched Crewe's boots. "You came through the front door?" "Aye, and left by the front door. Ask the ghost there." He jerked his head at Grimshaw. The butler bowed stiffly. "I showed Mr. Crewe out at 6:30. "Did he leave muddy footprints then?" asked Whimsy. Grimshaw hesitated. "It was raining. That was not the question. Rain is atmospheric. not evidential. No, my lord, I wiped the hall afterwards. Ah, your passion for wiping grows epic. Crew looked from one face to another. What's this about mud? Possibly nothing. Possibly a sermon in damp earth. Whimsy stepped nearer. Mr. Crew, did you return later by the churchyard? No. Did you possess a key to the vestry? No. Did you make an impression of one in wax? Crew stared, then barked a humorless laugh. Wax? I'm a farmer, not a stage burglar. Never underestimate agriculture. It has produced most English crime and all English politics. Mordaunt said, Where were you at 11:20? At home. Witness? My daughter. Reliable. She's 12, said Crew bitterly. So no, by police standards she's likely the head of an anarchist society. Whimsy smiled. Children are dangerous witnesses. They notice what adults edit out. Did she hear the church bell? Crew's expression changed. No. No? Our cottage is nearer the church than the sexton's, and Annie hears everything. She heard the rain gutter choking, heard Mrs. Plover's dog howl, heard a cart on the north road. She did not hear the vestry bell. Mordaunt frowned. But 3 people heard it. 3 people in the vicarage, said Whimsy softly. And the sexton. The sexton was outside. In his cottage, said Mordaunt. Then we must visit the sexton. Bells, like witnesses, may be persuaded to speak in one place and remain silent in another. Mrs. Vale's voice was tight. This is absurd. Most murders are. That is what distinguishes them from taxation. Whimsy turned abruptly to Grimshaw. When you wiped the passage yesterday morning, did you wipe before or after the vestry door was forced? The butler's pallor became almost luminous. After, my lord. Eleanor said, No, before. All eyes turned to her. I saw him from the stair, she said, before Inspector Mordaunt arrived. He was wiping the floor near the church passage. When he saw me, he hid the cloth behind him. Grimshaw's mouth moved soundlessly. Mordaunt stepped toward him. Well, I was protecting the household, whispered Grimshaw. From mud, said Whimsy. The butler looked at Mrs. Vale, then away. From scandal, my lord. Whimsy's face for once lost its foolish brightness. My dear Grimshaw, he said quietly, scandal is only murder's perfume. It does not cause the corpse. The sexton lived in a leaning cottage behind the churchyard wall, where the graves press so close upon the kitchen garden that cabbages and mortality seemed to have struck a practical arrangement. His name was Abel Troke, and he received them in shirt-sleeves with a pipe in one hand and a face composed almost entirely of wrinkles and suspicion. A bell, he said. I heard a bell at 11:20, asked Mordaunt. So I told you, by your clock, by my ears. Whimsy, who had been examining a row of damp boots by the hearth, looked up with delight. An admirable instrument, the ear. Unfortunately, it lacks hands. Did you look at a clock afterward? Troke scratched his chin. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Let us be reckless and choose one. The sexton spat neatly into the fire. Clock said 1:15. Mordaunt snapped, You told me 20 past. I told you near enough. Police like near enough when it saves walking. Whimsy beamed. Mr. Troke, I foresee between us a friendship founded upon mutual disrespect. Where were you when you heard it? In bed. With the window open? Shut. Rain falling? Aye. Wind. From east. Then it is curious you heard the vestry bell so clearly. The old man narrowed his eyes. Calling me liar? Not at all. I am calling the bell ambitious. Troke gave a reluctant cackle. It rang, but not like church bell, more like tinkle in the wall. The wall? Aye. There's an old service passage behind vicarage pantry. Blocked these 20 years, they say. Sound runs queer there. Rats, too. Mordaunt stared. You never mentioned a passage. You never asked after rats. Whimsy's expression had become lightly vacant. Always a bad sign for somebody else. An old passage, he murmured. Blocked, they say. Mr. Troke, who says. Parson said, years back. Said it was bricked after his first wife died. Damp came through. After she died, aye. She fell in the churchyard one winter. Broke her neck on them steps by the east door. Poor, soft thing. Mrs. Vale, who had insisted upon accompanying them as far as the cottage door and now stood rigid in the rain, said, "That has nothing to do with my husband's death?" "Madam," said Whimsy, "the past is rarely so polite as to remain irrelevant." Eleanor's face had altered. "My aunt died on the steps, so Parish said," muttered Troke, "though Parish says much after dark." "What else did Parish say?" asked Whimsy. The sexton looked at Mrs. Vale and shut his mouth. Whimsy took out his cigarette case, offered it, and received a look of contempt. "No, virtuous of you. I smoke because my vices are small and portable. Now, Mr. Troke, you heard the little bell in the wall. Did you hear any footsteps in the churchyard?" "Aye." Crewe, standing near the gate, stiffened. "Not mine." "No," said Troke, "too light for yours. Woman's step, maybe. Or gentleman trying not to be one." Whimsy's eyes moved toward the vicarage. "Direction? From vestry door toward the yews. There is a door from the vestry to the churchyard. Was bolted inside now. Covered by hanging gowns. Folk forget what they don't use." Mordaunt's face reddened. "We saw no door." "No," said Whimsy softly, "because someone was most anxious that you should admire the locked door you did see." They crossed back through the rain to the church. Inside, the air smelled of stone hymn books and extinguished candles. Whimsy went straight to the vestry, pushed aside the hanging surplices, and revealed a narrow wooden panel black with age. At its base, half hidden beneath a strip of matting, lay a smear of greenish clay. Mordaunt swore under his breath. Whimsy touched the bolt. It was old but recently oiled. "Behold," he said, "the miraculous exit, reduced to carpentry." Bellamy whispered, "Then the murderers escaped this ways?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Vale said, "but the key under his hand, the locked door, the window." "Yes," said Whimsy. "An arrangement composed for the benefit of people who enter by the front. How theatrical grief can be when it has a practical mind." He opened the hidden door. It gave upon a narrow slit between church wall and yew hedge. Rain dripped steadily from the black branches. In the soft earth were several blurred marks, nearly washed away, but one remained beneath the shelter of a root. A small heel print, sharp at the edge, not a farmer's boot, not a servant's shoe. Eleanor drew in her breath. Mrs. Vale looked at the print, and for an instant all the widowhood went out of her face. Whimsy straightened. "Inspector," he said, "we have been asking who entered the locked room. The better question, I fancy, is who needed the room to appear locked after he had already left it." Whimsy did not at once return to the drawing room. This annoyed Inspector Mordaunt, who had the practical man's preference for arresting somebody while the evidence was still damp. "We have a hidden door, a print, and a household lying like a cheap newspaper," said the inspector. "That seems enough to proceed. My dear Inspector, enough is a word which has hanged several innocent people and allowed several guilty ones to dine comfortably." He stood beneath the yew hedge, hat tilted back, looking not at the footprint, but at the church wall. Rain slid over the old stones and darkened the mortar. Above the hidden vestry door, scarcely visible beneath moss and ivy, was a small iron hook. "What hung there?" he asked Troke. The sexton squinted. "Lantern once. For winter services. Recently used? No." Whimsy reached up and touched the hook. His glove came away faintly oily. "No," he said. "Only recently touched." Mordaunt groaned. "By whom?" "That, Inspector, is the monotonous question which makes our profession almost respectable." They returned through the vestry. Whimsy paused by the bell-pull and tugged it once more. Again the kitchen bell rang distantly. Again there followed the faint, delayed click within the wall. "Behind the pantry," he murmured. "The ghost has domestic habits." Grimshaw, summoned with visible reluctance, led them to the vicarage pantry. It was a narrow, whitewashed room smelling of polish, cold meat, and fear. Shelves held jars, folded linen, candlesticks, and the spare vestry key upon a labeled hook. Whimsy examined the wall behind the flour bin and tapped it with his knuckles. Hollow. "Mr. Grimshaw, when was this passage blocked?" "Before my time, my lord." "How long have you served here?" 11 years. A lifetime in some houses. Mordaunt moved the flour bin aside. Behind it, the plaster showed cracks in a rectangular shape. Whimsy inserted the blade of his penknife and lifted. A panel came forward, not much, but enough to show darkness beyond. Eleanor whispered, "I never knew that was there." Mrs. Vale said, "Nor I." The lie was too prompt and too polished. Whimsy received it courteously as one receives a visiting aunt. "Then we shall all enjoy the pleasure of discovery together." The passage beyond was cramped, brick-lined, and thick with the sour breath of damp. Mordaunt fetched a lantern. They went in single file, Whimsy first, then the inspector, then Bellamy, while the others remained in the pantry under the supervision of Grimshaw, who looked like a man guarding his own execution. The passage ran between vicarage and church wall. Halfway along, a wire had been fastened recently to an old bracket. Whimsy lifted it with one finger. "Ah, our ambitious bell!" The wire passed through a crack toward the vestry mechanism. At the other end, near the pantry panel, it was tied to a little metal loop. "So someone could ring the vestry bell from here," said Mordaunt. "More accurately, someone could make others believe the vestry bell had been rung by the man inside. At 11:20, or whenever a rheumatic kitchen clock and a nervous household could be persuaded to agree." Bellamy's voice shook slightly. "Then Vale may have been dead before the bell rang, or alive after it. We must not become bigoted about corpses." At the far end of the passage they found a second panel opening near the vestry fireplace. It was hidden by the hanging cassocks. On the floor lay a single black thread caught on a splinter of wood. Whimsy lifted it. "Not from Mrs. Vale's mourning, I think, too coarse. Servant's cloth, perhaps, or a man's overcoat." When they emerged, Grimshaw was gone. Mary stood trembling by the pantry door. "He said he felt faint." "My lord." "Did he?" Whimsy's voice sharpened for the first time. "Inspector, faintness is a disease which travels rapidly toward railway stations." They found the butler in the servants' hall, not fleeing, but sitting rigidly at the table with his hands before him. Between them lay a visiting card, damp at one corner and bent across the middle. Whimsy picked it up. "Dr. Julian Lanyon." Eleanor made a little sound. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. Grimshaw spoke without looking up. "He came at 10 that night," he said. "The Reverend refused to see him. Mrs. Vale said he had never been here. I took the card away because she ordered me to." Whimsy turned the card over. On the back, in hurried pencil, was written, "Ask him about Alice. He will understand." For once, no one spoke lightly. Whimsy slipped the card into his case. "Alice," he said. "The first wife, I presume. How economical the dead are. They require only one name to ruin a room." Dr. Julian Lanyon arrived shortly before dusk, having been fetched from the inn by a constable, who plainly considered medicine a poor substitute for confession. He was a lean man in his early 30s with tired eyes, a rain-darkened coat, and the controlled manner of one who has passed through anger into something colder. Eleanor rose when he entered, then stopped herself. The restraint between them was more eloquent than any embrace. Mrs. Vale looked at him with an expression of perfect civility. "Dr. Lanyon," she said, "you choose a dramatic hour." "No," said Whimsy. "The hour chose him. Hours are often theatrical when people are not." Lanyon bowed slightly. "Lord Peter Whimsy?" "The same, though increasingly damp." "You came here Tuesday night at 10, I did. To see Reverend Vale." "Yes." "About Miss Harcourt?" "At first." Eleanor whispered, "Julian." He looked at her, and something in his face softened. "It is no use, Nell. He is dead, and the dead no longer have the privilege of terrifying the living." Mrs. Vale's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Whimsy said, "A wholesome sentiment, though not universally accepted in this house. You left a card with a message. Ask him about Alice." "Who was Alice?" "The Reverend's first wife, so we had gloomily supposed." Lanyon took a breath. "Alice Vale was my mother's sister. The family story was that she died by accident, fell on the church steps during frost. My mother never believed it. Before she died, she gave me 2 letters Alice had written. They were confused, frightened letters. She wrote that her husband had discovered something about her past and used it to break her. She wrote that if she died suddenly, it would not be God's will, however piously. Septimus explained it. Bellamy sat forward sharply. Why was this never brought to the authorities? My mother was ill, poor, and afraid. Reverend Vale was already a respected clergyman. Respectability is excellent armor. It turns away truth more efficiently than steel. Whimsy nodded. And on Tuesday you confronted him? I tried. Grimshaw took my card in, Mrs. Vale came out instead. She said the Reverend was unwell and would not receive me. That was untrue, said Eleanor. Yes, said Lanyon. I heard his voice from behind the study door. Mrs. Vale said, you cannot prove that. I do not need to prove it to you. No, said Whimsy gently, but you may need to prove it to Inspector Mordaunt, who has an official appetite. Mordaunt grunted. Lanyon continued. I waited outside by the churchyard. I meant to speak to Vale when he crossed to the vestry. He often worked there late, Eleanor had told me. At about 11 I saw him come through the covered passage. Alone? Lanyon hesitated. There was someone behind him, a woman. Mrs. Vale stood. This is monstrous. My dear madam, said Whimsy, monsters become less alarming when they use the back door. Lanyon went on, his voice hardening. I followed as far as the yews. The vestry light was burning. I heard voices, Vale's first, then hers. I could not hear the words, only the tone. He laughed once. Then there was a cry. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth. What kind of cry? Asked Whimsy. Not pain, shock, as if he had seen something. And then, silence. I waited perhaps 5 minutes. Then the hidden door opened. Mordaunt stepped forward. You saw who came out? No. The lantern went out at once. But someone passed within 3 feet of me, moving quickly. I smelled scent. Scent? Said Whimsy. Violets. All eyes went to Mrs. Vale. Her face remained composed, but the room seemed to see, all at once, the small purple bottle on her dressing table. Whimsy, however, did not look at her. He looked at Grimshaw. And after that, Doctor? I panicked. I thought if I spoke I would be accused. I had threatened Vale in my message, so I left. How noble, said Whimsy. The innocent are forever assisting the guilty by behaving like fools. Lanyon flushed, yes. At that moment, Mary, who had been standing near the door, gave a frightened little gasp. What is it? Mordaunt demanded. The scent, sir, she whispered. It wasn't only Madam who used violets. Whimsy turned. Mary stared at the floor. The Reverend kept a bottle too, in the vestry drawer. He said it was for old papers, to keep away damp and mold. Whimsy's expression altered. Slowly, almost tenderly, he smiled. Ah, he said, that is better, much better. We have been offered a wicked woman, which is convenient. But murder, Inspector, is rarely so obliging as convenience. Whimsy asked to be taken once more to the vestry, and this time no one protested. The little procession moved through the passage like mourners following a coffin, whose occupant had begun to give evidence. The room was darker now. Rain scratched at the window, and the hanging vestments stirred faintly in the draught from the concealed door, so that the white surplices seemed to breathe. Mordaunt set a lantern on the table. Its light shone upon the blotter, the inkstand, the chair, and the bell-pull with its innocent dangling cord. Now, said Whimsy, let us suppose, for the sake of sanity, that Reverend Vale was not killed by a phantom, a farmer, or a jealous widow conveniently soaked in violets. Mrs. Vale said coldly, your courtesy overwhelms me. It frequently has that effect. He opened the vestry drawer. It contained sealing wax, wafers, a rusty penknife, candle ends, and a small bottle with a glass stopper. Whimsy lifted it, removed the stopper, and sniffed. Violets, said Mordaunt. Violets pretending to be violets, said Whimsy. A dangerous profession. Bellamy frowned. What do you mean? I mean that this bottle contains oil of violets, yes, but not only that. Lanyon came forward. May I? Whimsy handed it to him. The doctor smelled it, then held it away sharply. Chloroform, faint but unmistakable. Eleanor gave a cry. Mrs. Vale whispered, no. Not enough to kill a man outright, Lanyon said. but enough, perhaps, to startle, sicken, or overpower someone with a weak heart. Was Reverend Vale's heart weak? Asked Whimsy. The doctor hesitated. I had heard so. He was not my patient. Bellamy said. He suffered attacks. He concealed them. Of course, said Whimsy. Tyrants dislike evidence of machinery. Mordaunt's face had grown grim. Then someone opened the bottle under his nose, perhaps, or persuaded him to open it himself. Whimsy sat in the chair where the dead man had sat. He placed his left hand on the arm and reached with his right toward the drawer. Imagine him here. He has come to the vestry after receiving, or expecting, some threatening communication. He is angry, self-righteous, perhaps frightened. He opens the drawer. He takes out the bottle. Why? To scent papers, said Bellamy. At 11 at night. With an enemy in the churchyard and a household full of listening ears. No. He takes it out because someone has made him believe it contains something important. Or because he recognizes it as connected with Alice. Lanyon looked up sharply. Whimsy nodded. The message on your card was bait, but not, I think, bait for Vale alone. He rose and examined the blotter. Beneath the top sheet, barely visible, was an impression. He held it near the lantern. Inspector, have you a soft pencil? Mordaunt supplied one. Whimsy shaded the paper lightly. Words emerged, ghostly and broken. I know what happened to Alice. Come alone, Eleanor whispered. Who wrote it? That, said Whimsy, is what our murderer expected us to ask. He pointed to the handwriting. It is large, uneven, emotional. It suggests a woman in agitation or a man imitating one. But look here, the capital A printed, not written. A habit of Mr. Bellamy's unless I misremember the note that summoned me. The solicitor became perfectly still. Mrs. Vale turned on him. Arthur? Bellamy's spectacles flashed white. This is absurd, not absurd, merely legal. You knew of Alice. You knew of the trust. You knew that Vale held papers damaging half the parish. More importantly, you knew he meant to alter his will. The room seemed to contract. He told you, asked Mordaunt. He did not need to. Mr. Bellamy has been carrying the fact about like a bad umbrella. Reverend Vale had discovered that his first wife left evidence of his cruelty with Bellamy's predecessor. Evidence suppressed to preserve the church, the family, and all the other respectable idols that demand human sacrifices. Vale meant to destroy it, and to disinherit Miss Harcourt if she married Dr. Lanyon. Bellamy's lips parted. You cannot prove murder. No, said Whimsy softly. But I can prove preparation, wax in the key. The concealed passage known through old estate papers. The bell rigged from the pantry. The note written to bring Vale here alone. The scented bottle doctored with chloroform. You did not stab him. You arranged a moral explosion and let his heart finish the work. Bellamy's hand moved toward his coat pocket. Mordaunt saw it too late. Whimsy did not. He had already stepped aside, almost lazily, and caught the solicitor's wrist. A small revolver clattered onto the stone floor. My dear Bellamy, said Whimsy, breathing a little faster, how very disappointing. Firearms are the last refuge of the unimaginative. Bellamy did not struggle after the revolver fell. That was the most terrible thing about him. A man in a passion may be pitied. A man who ceases resisting because resistance has ceased to be useful is something colder. Inspector Mordaunt picked up the weapon with a handkerchief and stared at it as if it had personally insulted him. You intended to shoot? I intended, said Bellamy, not to be ruined. My dear sir, said Whimsy, releasing his wrist, you confuse ruin with exposure. Ruin is what one does to oneself beforehand. Exposure is merely the bill. Bellamy gave a thin smile. Very pretty. You have the aristocratic gift for phrases. It is cheaper than responsibility. Eleanor stepped forward, trembling. You killed him to protect yourself? To protect many people, Bellamy said sharply. You know nothing. Your uncle was a disease. He had letters, accounts, confessions, every weakness that ever crawled into this parish. He used them. He enjoyed using them. When he found the Alice papers, he meant to destroy them because they were the one weapon that could touch him. I prevented that. By murder, said Lanyon, by justice. No, said Whimsy, and his voice was suddenly stripped of ornament. Do not put ermine on a rat. Justice does not require chloroform in a scent bottle and a bell wire through a pantry wall. Bellamy's face twitched. He would have ruined Eleanor. You did not kill him for Eleanor. You killed him because Vale had discovered your own part in suppressing Alice's letters. Your predecessor kept them, perhaps with instructions. You inherited the knowledge and buried it. Then Vale found out. A blackmailer blackmailing the custodian of blackmail. Really, the arrangement had almost too much symmetry. Mrs. Vale, very pale, said he knew. Bellamy looked at her with weary contempt. Septimus knew everything eventually. That was his genius. And my card? Asked Lanyon. Did you know I had come? I saw it on the salver. Grimshaw had left it there while he went to announce you. I read the message. It gave me what I needed. Whimsy nodded. Alice. Yes. I sent Vale a note in a disguised hand saying I knew the truth. I knew he would come to the vestry. He trusted locked doors and his own terror of scandal. I had already prepared the bottle. I had already taken the impression of the key. And the bell, to fix the time later than death, to make it appear he was alive in the room after I had gone. Beautifully shabby, murmured Whimsy. Mordaunt said, but Grimshaw. Bellamy glanced at the butler, who stood bowed like an old tree under snow. He saw me come through the pantry panel. Not my face, perhaps, but enough. Mrs. Vale made him hide the card because she feared Dr. Lanyon's scandal. Grimshaw then believed he was shielding her. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. I thought Julian had killed him. And so, said Whimsy gently, everyone protected the wrong secret, a common human economy. Bellamy suddenly laughed. It was a dry, papery sound. You speak as though you are above it all. Not above it, said Whimsy, merely at an angle. It gives a better view and a worse conscience. Mordaunt moved to Bellamy's side. Arthur Bellamy, I must ask you to come with me. The solicitor inclined his head. There is one satisfaction. What is that? Asked Whimsy. I frightened Septimus Vale before he died. Nobody answered. For a moment, the vestry seemed filled not with triumph, but with the damp, sour residue of old cruelty. The lantern flame trembled. The white surplices hung motionless against the wall, empty and reproachful. At last Whimsy stooped, picked up the stopped French clock from the table where he had brought it, and set it beside the bottle. Poor Alice, he said. Even her clock told the truth more bravely than the living. Eleanor looked at him. The clock, mister? Bellamy snobbed it while crossing the drawing room after stealing Lanyon's card. He had chloroform on his glove from the prepared bottle. It softened the old works oil and jammed the mechanism when he touched the keyhole at the back. A trifling accident and therefore invaluable. Bellamy's mouth tightened. He had no answer left. Whimsy turned to the inspector. Take him away before he recovers his eloquence. It is his most dangerous weapon. Bellamy was taken out through the vestry door, not the hidden one. There are occasions when symbolism, though vulgar, becomes irresistible. Inspector Mordaunt followed with the expression of a man who had solved a case by the uncomfortable method of being shown that he had not solved it at all. In the drawing room, the clock still disagreed. The French clock stood silent on the table, rescued from its mantelpiece like a witness brought down from the gallery. Mrs. Vale sat beneath the portrait of her dead husband and looked neither guilty nor innocent, but merely exhausted by the discovery that grief is not simplified by truth. I did not love him, she said suddenly. Whimsy, who was lighting a cigarette, paused. That is not yet a criminal offense, though several moralists have advocated it. I feared him. I hated him sometimes, but I did not kill him. No, said Whimsy, you only protected the appearance of him. It is a common widow's task, and often more laborious than marriage. She gave a small, bitter smile. You are cruel, when necessary, never efficiently. Eleanor stood by the window with Dr. Lanyon beside her, not touching, not speaking, but with the fragile air of people who had survived a storm and were embarrassed by sunlight. Bellamy's confession had been brief after the arrest, but sufficient. The papers concerning Alice had been found in his office safe, preserved not from conscience but from habit. Lawyers, Whimsy observed, were the natural taxidermists of other people's sins. Grimshaw entered carrying the silver salver. Upon it lay Lagnon's bent visiting card. "My lord," said the butler. "I should have spoken." "Yes," said Whimsy. "Several people should have done several things. If mankind acted promptly on that principle, detective stories would be reduced to pamphlets." Grimshaw bowed his head. "You were loyal," Whimsy added. "Unfortunately, loyalty, like arsenic, is useful only in the proper dose." The butler withdrew, looking a little less like a corpse and a little more like a man who had been condemned to continue living. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, the churchyard showed black and silver under a reluctant moon. The yews stood motionless, having surrendered their supernatural pretensions to drainage, carpentry, wire, wax, chloroform, and human fear. Mordaunt returned near midnight, damp and chastened. "He has made a statement," he said. "Enough for now. I owe you an apology, Lord Peter. Good heavens, don't pay it all at once. Leave something for your memoirs." The inspector glanced at the hidden passage door, now standing open. "Scotland Yard will be interested after all." "Scotland Yard," said Whimsy, "has a beautiful instinct for arriving after the furniture has been arranged." Eleanor came to him then. "Was my uncle murdered because of Alice?" "Partly. But murders are seldom born from one parent." Alice gave the name. Fear supplied the motive. Pride found the method. Respectability held the door. She looked down at the little French clock. "Will it ever run again?" "Almost certainly. Clocks are less sentimental than people." At the front door, Bunter appeared with Whimsy's coat, immaculate despite the damp universe. "The car is ready, my lord. Thank you, Bunter. We flee before anyone asks us to stay for breakfast." Mrs. Vale rose. "Lord Peter." He turned. "What should one do?" she asked. "With a house full of secrets?" Whimsy considered the question gravely. "Open the windows," he said. "Then burn what ought never to have been kept, read what ought never to have been hidden, and forgive only after one has stopped lying. Forgiveness before truth is merely bad housekeeping." He stepped out into the cold fen night. Behind him, Blackthorn Vicarage stood pale and stiff among its yews, respectable still, but no longer quite believed. As the motor car moved away, the church bell gave a single accidental note in the wind. "Listen, my lord," said Bunter. "The bell." "Quite," said Whimsy, settling back. "At last it rings for itself, a great improvement on most witnesses."